Okay, strap in, because I'm going to be talking about Baldur's Gate 3 before everyone forgets it existed in favor of Starfield. I'm about 20 hours in and flirting with the end of Act 1, so maybe there will be a retraction when I complete the game, but in light of the discourse around this title, I thought I would try to put on my sensible pants and wade in a bit, especially because of all the breathless think pieces about how Baldur's Gate 3 has set a new standard for RPGs, and that has me a little shook, so I'm going to be careful about spoilers here. Nothing I talk about will be part of the main plot of the game, so if you're still thinking of playing the game, you should be okay. I want to say now that Baldur's Gate 3 is a very ambitious game. There's no way around the sheer volume of choices, side quests, voice acting, and customization that this game affords. One of the most oft repeated takes is that this is the closest translation to an actual in person tabletop RPG experience with a living DM a video game has ever gotten. Which in my experience is a pretty accurate statement. The feeling of reactivity in the world and environment is palpable. Spells that would have just been omitted from previous D&D games for being too utility, spells like Mage Hand or Friends, have actual use in this game where it feels like everything can be manipulated and every NPC down to the lowest goblin grunt can be spoken to. But in some ways, this pliability in the game is a sort of uncanny valley because it's so realistic in some ways games haven't been before. It makes the areas where you are slammed back into the reality that you're playing a set path video game even more obvious and galling. So let's talk about it. Now, let's talk about challenge rating. In 5th edition, the system is pretty broken. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it is a thing. In a nutshell, based on the size and level of the party, a DM should be able to determine whether a particular counter they have planned is trivial, normal, hard, or deadly. Now, obviously, it's not a given. Even a deadly encounter can be a walk in the park if your monk has stunning strike or your spellcasters are able to come first in the turn order. But a good DM wants their planned encounters during a session to fit into that normal to hard range. Broken as it is, the tool exists to make sure that the party isn't pushed into a fight they can't win. So, even during the Gygaxian days of earlier edition D&D, a good dungeon master wouldn't throw a bunch of third level characters at a lich. Because they would get destroyed and that wouldn't be fun for anybody. In Baldur's Gate 3, after the intro sequence, you're dumped into a large map and set exploring. It's similar to Skyrim in how quickly your map populates with quest markers, but unlike Skyrim, your enemy difficulty level does not scale to the party. A pack of gnolls is a pack of gnolls, and their hit points and abilities don't care if you're level 3 or level 8. So, just about every other RPG that has this sort of dynamic that allows for open world experience, they'll give your characters some sort of heads up if the encounter is likely to result in your death. So, a color coded nameplate or a skull next to their level indicator. But in Baldur's Gate 3, you can be chasing down a quest and find yourself absolutely bodied by an encounter that you have no chance of winning, an encounter that a DM at the table would just not have even planned for that session. The DM would be able to communicate to the players, maybe a perception check with a low DC or the like of, hey, the sheer number of nulls and the fact that there are more than a couple of them, appear to be the kind of bigger, stronger, smarter than the rest means that this is going to be a pretty difficult fight if you decide not to take up their offer to talk and just, roll initiative. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't really have that. Obviously, it does offer multiple options to deal with said nulls. Don't get me wrong, but if you're playing that morally upright murder hobo who isn't interested in parlaying with hags and nulls and other nasty creatures, being able to size up a potential opponent before you smack talk them, that's a useful thing. It's a constant refrain in this video, but you can lose a lot of playtime backtracking after beating your head against a wall in this game, because the encounter difficulty isn't something that you can tell before you decide to engage. And that's not a great feeling. And on the subject of save scumming, so I want to be clear that this upcoming section, that Baldur's Gate 3, is obviously not the first game to have this problem, but I do think that it suffers a bit of backsliding on progress that other games have made in the arena of dialogue intent and interaction save scumming, to the point where I'm sort of surprised that this is a problem in a current year game. So anybody who has found themselves in an accidental relationship with Liara or Liliana knows exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about accidental romance options. Most games now will indicate in their dialogue tree or wheel with a dialogue option that will trigger a romance flag with that character. So there's no ambiguity on the player's part when they are making a move. And I think this is one of those things that's really important, that difference between intent and perception. If I'm hitting on you, I know I'm hitting on you. Whether or not you pick up what I'm laying down, when I say maybe you and I can go, get to know each other a little bit better over some coffee, there's no ambiguity in my brain about what my ask is. Having ambiguous player intent isn't interesting from a gameplay standpoint because it divorces you from the immersive experience of knowing what you want. It's always frustrating when a game's NPC misunderstands what you're saying, but that's nothing compared to thinking you're giving somebody a friendly greeting and what comes out of your mouth is like a five-alarm invective involving their mother. I'm going to compare this game to another title that came out this year, which is Failbetter's Mask of the Rose. There's a situation where I accidentally blew off a character I didn't mean to. He, kind of gave me an early and awkward advance, and I laughed. And I wasn't sure if I was literally laughing at him or giving him a kind of like, ah, ha, 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 oh, you response that was, neither encouraging nor dismissive. And of course, he interpreted it as the latter. But later on, I literally got the chance to reset with him, to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. And frankly, that blew my mind. That the most human thing ever to say, I am really sorry, you misinterpreted what I said, I didn't mean that, is something we're just now seeing in games. So when we talk about game settings that are, setting a new bar, I think Mask of the Rose actually sets a better bar than Baldur's Gate 3 does. And as far as like, I am just far more impressed with that simple but incredibly useful advance that they made in their dialogue system. I mean, of course, this doesn't necessarily just have to do with romance. The dialogue system doesn't really lend itself to good flow. You might have a situation where you're trying to convince a character to let you into a room you're not allowed into, and so just like in D&D, you might have that option to persuade or intimidate, deceive, or even intuit via insight or detect thoughts your way through the challenge. Part of the fun of the tabletop environment is that reactiveness when that die roll is asked for from the DM. But in a game like Baldur's Gate, getting that failed is just an invitation to reload, Rather, like a more immersive gameplay style would just to have the game roll those dice in the back end and then present the options that won in the dialogue tree. And if you failed intimidation, that dialogue option doesn't even appear, and there is no message on the screen letting you know that you failed intimidation. You get the options in front of you, and I know that a lot of people realizing that there are passive roles happening behind the scenes, would probably do more save scumming to try and fish those options up. But I do know that seeing a failure flash up on the screen definitely prompts my try again impulse in, a digital environment. Ultimately, the dialogue options could be simple, gameplay settings, so not necessarily in a like easy, normal, hard mode, but like a separate setting for you could have tabletop style, which is, the experience as it is. Streamlined is that pre-roll option that I just described, and then hell, you could even have a third option that's just like, hey, blow open all the doors. I just want to auto succeed those options because this is not the part of the game that's engaging to me. I just want to be able to cruise through the story, and I don't want to be bothered with, the dialogue and the dice rolling and all of that stuff. This leads me to a larger point about failed rolls. Optimally, doing a passive roll for something like a perception or insight check should happen quietly on the DM side with only a success being reported. Like, after all, in real life, if you're walking down the sidewalk and there is a snake in the grass next to you, you either notice the snake or you don't. You don't have a moment where you realize that you, quote, missed something nearby because you failed to perceive the snake. Again, a good DM can massage a failed roll. For example, if you failed that perception check to notice the snake in the grass, the snake isn't going to attack you. The DM might say that you see something move out of the corner of your eye, but then when you look to figure out what it was, it's gone. But again, in Baldur's Gate 3, it just informs you that you failed a check and then moves on. In an environment, this is usually okay because even if you fail to spot the place where the chest is buried, Astarion or Shadowheart, they might pass that check. I think the overall passive roles aren't as much of a game breaker as the dialogue roles are, but I think a lot of this really boils down to the idea that telling a player they failed a role breaks the immersion of playing and causes them to reload, which is, a frustrating experience, especially at a game that doesn't have a good, interval autosave feature. If you forget to hit that F5 key, realizing you biffed a clutch roll, that could be a really unpleasant experience if, you realize like, oh, I just lost 15, 20, 30 minutes of gameplay. Okay, so this next section is the closest we're going to get to spoilers. And this is a section where I talk a little bit about the companions. Again, I'm not going to spoil their plots beyond anything that isn't revealed extremely early on. Even if knowing of a companion's existence constitutes a spoiler for you, then you might want to skip this section. So, when you first meet your companions, no one really wants to hang out with you. Obviously, the situation you find yourself in is stressful and not conducive to like automatic besties. But I remember back when Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access, someone had noted that it wasn't really fun to be dropped into a party of people who don't trust you and don't want to be with you except circumstances forcing the association. And that actually did give me pause. I was kind of joking in chat with friends like, when I'm trying to have fun, I don't want to be negged by some jerk halfling, right? Which makes it way more awkward when at the end of Act 1, suddenly a switch flips and everyone wants to just bang you. I checked my approval levels. Everyone was still at, like, neutral. I didn't even, like, max out my approval tree and everybody's, like, humping my leg. And yet, everyone I talked to had the option to just, like, take the express train to Pound Town. No warnings. And this is where I'm just going to come out and say it. Baldur's Gate 3 is written for men. The female player is an afterthought if she was thought about at all. And obviously, the female player is not a monolith. There are going to be women playing it who don't have a problem with how the romance and sex is set up in the game. Just like there's going to be men who do. So, wherever you fall on like the gender spectrum, let's just talk about masculine and feminine outside of kind of biological sex for the purposes of the rest of this section. So let's talk about these companions. At the end of Act 1, you should have your primary six, unless you decided to kill a couple along the way. Three women and three men, and then you might also have some additional characters based on what choices you made in the Goblin's Fortress. Spoiler, spoiler, spoiler. Let me describe the companions in some very broad strokes. So you have, on the girl side, you have Lae'zel, a Githyanki warrior woman with a massive chip on her shoulder. You have Shadowheart, a secretive, damaged goth girl cleric who wants nothing more than to pour her little tortured soul out to you. And you have Karlach, a bone vivant tiefling barbarian. And if you're playing a character that is into women, yeah, you got a couple options here. For the male companions, there's Asterion, an extremely swish rogue, Gale, a pretty swish mage, and Will, a slightly swish warlock. None of these guys are specifically gay. Gale will even say that his last sexual partner was female coded, though frankly a little intimidating to compare with if I do say so myself. But it's clear to me that the male romance options were built with a male player in mind. The player is assumed to be either a straight male or a gay male, and the NPCs are sort of written accordingly. My suspicion is that gay women will actually do all right with this setup, in the characters like Lae'zel or Karlach. These would have been walled off as straight only in a BioWare game, which was a frequent complaint I'd heard from lesbian gamers, which is this character is very, very clearly somebody that a lesbian would want to have a relationship with, and yet they've kind of said, nope, nope, that's straight only. But, what about straight women? As a straight girl with a bunch of gay friends, it feels sort of wrong and creepy to romance a male character who is so clearly coded as gay, in the way that Asterion and Gale are. So, like, if you don't connect with Will, you better hope for other options down the road. I mean, I now have Halsin, after all, and I mean, granted, I literally met him when he was just being a big old bear, but I'm sure that's nothing. And before we get further into this, I do want to go back to Mask of the Rose. This is the part of the character setup screen, and I think it's far more important to player experience than whether or not to show a character's ding dong. This question is basically asking the player where they fall in the romance and sex matrix. So, do you want romance but no sex, sex but no romance, neither sex nor romance, or maximum messy? And this is, again, a standard that any game with a romance or sex element needs to adopt, because this is critical. So, just ask at some point before a player is put into any physical or romantic situations whether or not they even want that in the game, and then deactivate the content they don't want. Everything I'm describing becomes a zillion times less fraught if the player is able to declare their preferences beforehand. Okay, so back to the end of Act 1. This is where the game just completely flips the switch, and every NPC is now opening the door for sex. A few of them are monogamous, which can be a little frustrating because I misinterpreted Gail's pickup line, and suddenly everyone is commenting on my relationship with him. And I'm like, what now? And that gets back to an earlier point. And the problem is that, especially because there's monogamy in play, the relationships are starting from what some would consider a middle or end point. There's no flirting. There's no first kiss. There's no touchy feely discussions about a potential relationship and what that might mean. It's just an express train to Pound Town. So I assume that the relationship would follow and develop after Act One. I haven't gotten to that yet, but for a lot of people, and I'm going to say women especially, the purpose of a romantic plot is that build from giddy flirtation through deepening feelings, and then sex is an expression of that development, not necessarily a first step, especially when your ability to dump and move on to another might be limited in a game where there's going to be flagging. So obviously there are people who feel differently, and the like, we fell dick first into love is a pretty common experience for a lot of people. But if your game is going to have a romance component in it at all, you should include options for romance that fall into what it could be called a more traditional romance novel format. There's a reason those things sell like they do, after all. Further to that point, I noticed that the male characters in the game are much more like passive than the female characters. Both Lae'zel and Karlach will not be ambiguous at all about wanting to make the beast with two backs with you. But the male characters are a lot more subtle, like I said. Didn't even realize I'd stumbled into a relationship with Gale. I think a fair amount of this chalks up to how straight male gamers be when someone even puts the possibility of gayness in front of them. But I think it might also have to do with how female players might be misunderstood. And this is the part where I'm going to have to be really kind of careful and deliberate in my wording, because I'm going to be speaking generally here. There is a discourse, mostly centered around Gen Z, of the creepy male. The creepy male is the dude who comes out of nowhere, bothers you when you don't want to be bothered, and like hits on you out of nowhere and doesn't take no for an answer. And it is really easy to boil down the creepy male discourse into men can never hit on women because it's always creepy. And I think you see this translated into video games lately, because it just seems like the male characters never initiate or pursue a player character of either gender. And I think, again, there's probably a lot of homophobia playing into this as well. But the problem of the creepy male isn't that he's hitting on you. The problem of the creepy male is that he's bothering you and he won't take no for an answer. As it happens, a lot of women actually do like the attention and flattery of a good flirt. They want to be pursued romantically, just not in a way that makes them feel like they will be, the subject of violence if they turn it down. Hell, sometimes it can be fun to flirt with people you have no sexual interest in, because it can just be gratifying in its own right for both parties. In an RPG like Baldur's Gate, this is so easily solved for without making all of the male characters passive, and in fact, it might be kind of a good object lesson for straight males playing the game. A male character might flirt or hit on you when you approach them to talk, and there is a clear, unambiguous dialogue option that says, "Sorry, I'm not interested in that sort of relationship with you. Let's move on." And then they say, "Oh, okay, apologies." And then they drop it, and the companionship continues without further flirting. Boom, simple. So I want to be very clear. Baldur's Gate 3 has me in its clutches. When I can spare an hour or two to sit down and deal with the side quest, it is like my top priority right now. And I think that says a lot. For all the stuff I pointed out before this, the fact that it's the only thing that is actually a higher priority gaming leisure activity for me is my actual Thursday night Curse of Strahd group on Roll20. That says a lot about how this game has engaged me. So part of it is simply that epic fantasy RPGs aren't thick on the ground for the most part. Like, if I were really into space survival horror or tile placement environment builder games, I'd have a whole buffet of options. But for those of us who like good old dragons and dungeons in whatever order, Baldur's Gate 3 is the first proper game of its type since, I'm going to say, Greedfall. So there's a lot of excitement about having that option. But I do think that it's going to be a short-lived love affair. I can kind of see Baldur's Gate 3 enjoying the same sort of tale as a game like BioShock Infinite, a game that absolutely ruled the roost for the few weeks after its release, and then it just slipped away into obscurity. I don't know anybody who ranks BioShock Infinite as like a favorite game of all time, and in fact, most people dismiss it as pretty but ultimately pointless entry into a series. Patches and mods might give Baldur's Gate 3 longevity closer to Skyrim. There is certainly enough content to allow for it to have a ridiculous player lifespan. It will also probably be the solution to some of my minor gripes, like the character generator being a little bit more threadbare than I expected. I know that there are already some mods out there that take care of a few of the save scumming problems already, but it's important to note that modders are a tiny minority of players, and unless an official patch fixes these issues, most people are going to set it aside and not be interested in arguments that the game totally works out. If you get a Nexus mod account and install these 15 mods and their dependencies, like it's just a non-starter. Baldur's Gate 3 definitely wants you to replay it. The sheer breadth of choices can give anybody but the most hardcore, realized role player decision paralysis at just about any juncture. Like any RPG, you probably want to hold off on an evil playthrough for your second time through, but once that shine comes off the penny and you're left with long dice rolls and save scum hell, like, are you really going to? And that's what it comes down to for me with Baldur's Gate 3 is, again, really enjoying it right now, but frankly, I'm not sure if it's going to be a love that lasts for the ages.